For the next video in this series, I figured we could talk about foraging, the ethics and some general guidelines to doing so. I think this video is going to be in two parts. This first half with all of the important understandings and things to keep in mind, and the second video kind of detailing some valuable understandings, some terms and things that will help you to identify plants and move forward through, well, foraging. In this video, I have 5 major topics that I will cover that all have little bits and pieces held within them. So without further ado, let's get started. First and foremost, it is essential that you harvest only in clean locations. This means avoid roadsides, electrical lines, the foundations of buildings, railroads, and so on. Anything like this, it's best to stay at least 30 feet back, especially roads or railroads, as they are typically heavily polluted areas. It is also important to steer clear of polluted rivers or floodplains, or any areas that have been previously sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, which is a big part of why you steer clear of buildings. Not to mention, older buildings also tend to have lead paint that has chipped off and gone into the ground. But additionally, you may want to avoid public parks or areas with a great deal of landscaping. Many herbs are really good at collecting and accumulating toxins, including heavy metals. These are not things that you want to ingest and absolutely not something you want to utilize in medicine. And so when you're foraging, it is essential to have an understanding of the location from which you are gathering plants. Otherwise, you can end up doing more harm than good. Personally, I steer clear of city parks or areas with heavy residents unless I am fully aware of how this land has been used. It is just not worth the potential risk that it could have contaminants. I tend to prefer going to state parks or national forests, areas that are kind of wild and have been just left to be. Of course, the accessibility to these things will be very different depending on where you live. When I was living in Virginia, I had access to my yard and my neighbors' yards, and it was all a very rural area where I had a pretty good understanding of how the land had been used. But moving to a city, it has far more density and far more pollution, and I wouldn't trust any of the herbs growing around here. So I drive a little further to get to places that are safer to forage. I do have to get permits for some of the places I go to, and this is something you should research wherever you live. The access you have to land is going to be different, and it's important to have awareness of where you have permissions to forage and where you don't. But it is absolutely essential that you focus on only going to places that are clean and free of pollutants, pesticides, toxins, and are far away from places that may bring that to the forefront. Next, only forage abundant plants and make sure to leave them in abundance, for the most part. This doesn't really count for any invasive species, but I'll delve into that in a moment. For the majority of the plants you may be harvesting, it is important to research the population size in your area and perhaps the plant in general. Never forage endangered species or struggling species. If they are growing in the wild, allow them to continue to grow. Don't mess with those populations. They are struggling enough, and it is important to help them, not just take from them. Personally, I tend to choose more weedy medicinals for my medicine making and foraging, such as nettles, cleaver, violets, dandelion, things like that that grow in such incredible abundance that you really aren't going to harm the population by harvesting them. It is still essential that you leave enough of those populations for them to continue to flourish, continue to grow, and also so that they can continue to support the ecosystem. A plant such as clover or violets, they're very important to the local bee populations, and you don't want to take all of those flowers away from the nature around you. Thus, the harvesting abundance, yet still leaving it abundant. Now, like I said, invasive species don't really count. Invasive species are species that have infiltrated your local area. They're plants that aren't native to that land, and often they tend to choke out the local flora. And so you actually help the ecosystem by taking as much of this invasive species as you can. Thus the importance of researching all of the herbs you're working with and what you hope to gather, because some things you need to leave alone, other things should really be taken out of the ground anyways. This is a very important step that I find a lot of people forgetting to do or mentioning, and it can really make a big difference in your local environment and making sure that you can continue to gather these herbs year after year. And the next thing, which is sort of in a similar vein to this, it's important that you follow the best regenerative practices when harvesting the plants you are hoping to. This mainly comes in the form of knowing when the best time is to harvest the plant and which parts are best or how best to harvest from said plant. Generally, it's best to harvest roots from a plant after it has flowered and gone to seed, or when it's dormant, typically in the fall, winter, and early spring. Many herbaceous plants are best harvested really early on in their growth when they're still really green and pliable. This is mainly because it's a little more enjoyable to work with them before they become really woody and fibrous. And some herbs are better harvested after the first frost, such as rose hips. However, if you're harvesting something like bark, I found it is best to take an entire limb off the tree, take all of the bark from said limb, and use that. It is ill-advised to harvest directly from the trunk. It can offer or open the tree up to a lot of disease and pathogens that you don't want to. And taking just the branch leaves a small wound versus this really large wound that further opens the door for contaminants to get into the tree and kill it. Similarly, when harvesting roots, only take part of the root if it's a cluster, or take the right part of the root. There are all sorts of different roots of plants, and for many of them you can take a pretty decent amount of the root but still allow the plant to continue to flourish. It's important, however, to cut back the green growth if there is any at the time, so that it doesn't attempt to keep so much of a plant alive after you've taken a pretty good amount of it. And be sure to plant roots all the way back the way that they were, at the same depth with all of their dirt packed in. That way they will most likely go back into living life in a very comfortable, good way. Additionally, it's important to leave leafy or flowering plants with enough of the plant to continue to survive when you can, and make sure that it can still reproduce. Something kind of like elderberry or elderflower. A lot of times I have seen people take all of the elderflowers off of a tree, and if you take all of the flowers, then it's not going to be able to produce any berries, which are essential to the plant's reproductive process. So try to be conscious of those ethics when harvesting. Once again, this is less important with invasive species because they're choking out your ecosystem and they shouldn't really be there. So it's okay to take more from those populations, but if it's a native plant, be very careful and very respectful of this being its home and push to allow it to continue to flourish. Next, and the most important rule of foraging, is to be absolutely certain of your identification of the plant. Be sure to research more than you believe is possibly necessary, know all of the identifying factors, and have complete awareness of this herb, where it grows, what it's like, what it likes, any lookalikes that it has. Make sure when you come across it to triple check its identity, check all of the little pieces that you know make it what it is, and make sure it's not a lookalike. Also, it's pretty important to make sure it's the right species. Something like the Pinus genus, you're pretty okay using all of those rather interchangeably, but there are quite a few herbs that exist in the same genus, where their species exist in the same genus, that some are medicinal and some are deadly. Or other times they aren't quite that severe, but one is just a better medicine. And so having that awareness going in and being able to identify the separate species is essential to, well, foraging the right thing. It's also a really good idea to get to know the poisonous plants in your area. In the mountains here, there's tons of foxglove, and along the waterways, there's poison hemlock everywhere. These are deadly poisonous herbs, and I have seen too many people picking them for bouquets. It is important to have awareness of these herbs that could kill you, especially if they're herbs that have common lookalikes. Poison hemlock looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace, which is a beautiful flower to add to bouquets and to work with. But if you mix the two up, it can be a deadly mistake. So having that understanding of what is dangerous in your area could save your life or just really save you from some pretty nasty experiences. And lastly, with this section, don't get comfortable. I have rarely seen people who are just starting out with foraging actually misidentify a plant that they're really trying to identify. But I have seen people who are really experienced do it because they get comfortable, and that can be a really bad mistake. This is especially true when the plants aren't fully either flowering or in these very clear states. So a lot of times early spring herbs look very similar, and that can prove deadly if you aren't being careful. So always be 100% on and aware while foraging. And finally, in conjunction with this one and the one previously, make sure you're harvesting the correct portion of the plant that actually has the medicine that you are hoping to gather. If one part of the plant is edible or medicinal, that doesn't mean that all parts of the plant are as well. Something like elder flowers and elderberries can be crafted into medicine. And there are some arguments for the other parts of the plant, but in most cases, those will make you severely ill. Ingesting the leaves or the bark or the roots is not a good idea. But the berries and the flowers are wonderful medicines, and perhaps one of my favorite medicinals ever. And there are many herbs like this, where parts of the plants are sometimes even deadly. So being very aware of what is medicine and what is not is essential to your health and being good. Foraging is not something to take lightly. It can end in death if you are not careful, or severe illness, or truly disable you. Not all herbs are friendly and safe. It can be very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. So be careful, be aware of the dangers, and be committed to being safe and ethical about foraging. This can be a really fun and empowering activity. Going out, gathering your own food and medicine is a beautiful experience, but it's not something to take lightly. You really have to have the know-how to be able to do this. My hope is that this video outlined some of the general ideas that you need to look into for each plant. It is, of course, out of the scope of this video to delve into all of these things with each and every plant that you may wish to go forage. Additionally, the information will continue to change as time goes on, especially when it comes to endangered species. I will add in the description a current list of endangered species, some good ones to keep in mind of medicinals that you should just leave to grow in the wild. But that will only be as current as when this video was posted, so it is important to look for more, and it certainly will not be a complete list on this topic, but I'm hoping that it will give you a little bit of a start. The main takeaway from this video is to research and to build awareness of your ecosystem, the plants you are hoping to forage, and kind of develop some pretty good checks and balances for yourself when it comes to foraging, and to have some pretty good careful awareness of what you're doing. There are a lot of ethics involved, and there are a lot of guidelines, but once you get them down and you're used to them, it is very easy and a beautiful connecting process. Like I said, there will be a part 2 to this video that covers more of the language used. I really want to delve into the botany terms used to identify plants. I think it will really help to empower that ability of understanding which plants are which. It is a big part of my ability to distinguish herbs, and I will cover some bigger ideas within all of that. It will probably be up in the next handful of weeks. I kind of want to be jumping between medicine making, foraging, and all of these things that intertwine to continue to build this platform of knowledge and understanding for you to go forward and have some self-sufficiency with regards to all of this. but this felt like a very important video to make to kind of open the door to more when it comes to foraging, harvesting, drying herbs, and working with them. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful and enjoyed it. If you can and would like to, I'd really appreciate it if you checked out my Patreon. There I share art, herbal profiles, book recommendations, and I've even started doing monthly workshops. In those, you all pick a topic and I do a live stream on the last Saturday of every month. It's available for 2 weeks after the live stream, so if you miss it, you can still catch it. But I have a lot of fun teaching it. It's a very engaging classroom environment where I get to have a Q&A throughout and just bounce off you guys through the lesson. Also, if you haven't seen my other channel, I'd recommend checking it out. There I share vlogs, more of all of this stuff. There's a lot more herbalism and general daily life over there, so if that sounds like something you want to see, go ahead and check it out. Both of these are linked in the description down below. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.